Buongiorno a chi ci ascolta e benvenuti al Centro Studi Americani. Sono Annalisa Capristo e sono bibliotecaria qui al centro. Oggi abbiamo il piacere di ospitare la professoressa Lauren Braun-Strumfels, che nei giorni scorsi ha partecipato al convegno Managing Migration in Italy and the United States, organizzato dal Dipartimento di Scienze Politiche dell'Università Roma Tre. Gli atti del convegno verranno pubblicati da De Gruyter e ne saranno curatori scientifici la professoressa Braun-Strumfels, i professori Maddalena Marinari, presidente eletta della Migration and Ethnic History Society, e Daniele Fiorentino, direttore del Dipartimento di Scienze Politiche di Roma Tre. La professoressa Braun-Strumfels è Associate Professor of History al Cedar Crest College e fa parte del comitato esecutivo della Labor and Working Class History Association. Nel 2014 è stata borsista presso l'American Academy di Roma e nel 2020 ha ottenuto una Fulbright Research Lectureship in storia degli Stati Uniti presso il Dipartimento di Scienze Politiche dell'Università Roma Tre. Tra le sue pubblicazioni più recenti ricordiamo il saggio Binational Gatekeepers, the Italian Government and U.S. Border Enforcement in 1890s, uscito nella rivista Labor, Studies in Working Class History nel 2021. Il saggio costituisce uno dei capitoli della sua monografia Partners in Gatekeeping, How Italy Shaped the Enforcement of U.S. Immigration Law Over 10 Pivotal Years, 1891-1901, di prossima pubblicazione negli Stati Uniti per una casa editrice accademica. La ricerca della professoressa Braun-Strumfels è incentrata sul tema delle restrizioni all'immigrazione negli Stati Uniti in una prospettiva transnazionale, in particolare per quanto ha riguardato l'Italia tra fine Ottocento e inizio Novecento. La sua è un'interpretazione di grande interesse che si iscrive nel solco della storiografia più recente su queste tematiche, ma con un punto di vista innovativo, proprio perché riferita al caso italiano. Con l'aumento vertiginoso dei flussi migratori, entrambi i paesi dovettero mettere a punto nuove strutture burocratiche per gestire questo processo. Per gli USA e la collaborazione dei governi stranieri, fra cui l'Italia, pur in una relazione asimmetrica, come la definisce la professoressa, si rivelò fondamentale per strutturare la nuova politica di controllo dei confini, gatekeeping, e di remote control. Il periodo preso in considerazione dall'autrice è il decennio 1891-1901, cruciale per lo sviluppo di questa politica di controllo. Nel marzo 1891 negli Stati Uniti viene emanato l'Immigration Act, che centralizzò le procedure di immigrazione ponendole sotto il controllo federale e creò l'Office of Superintendent of Immigration. Dopo la legge del 1882, che aveva escluso gli immigrati cinesi, si trattò di una tappa legislativa di fondamentale rilevanza. Sempre nel marzo 1891 ebbe luogo il linciaggio di 11 immigrati italiani a New Orleans, il più grave linciaggio di italiani negli Stati Uniti, che provocò la temporanea interruzione delle relazioni diplomatiche fra i due paesi. Il 1901 invece è l'anno in cui in Italia entrò in vigore la prima in materia di immigrazione e venne creato il Commissariato Generale dell'Immigrazione. Attraverso i documenti diplomatici italiani, nonostante le lacune, è possibile osservare lo strutturarsi e il funzionamento del sistema americano di selezione ed esclusione dei potenziali immigrati in questa prima fase, che gettò le basi per le ulteriori restrizioni e strategie di controllo preventivo, entrate successivamente in vigore negli anni 20 del Novecento. Ricordiamo che nel 2024 ricorre il centenario dell'Immigration Act, the Johnson-Reed Act, il cui sistema delle quote fu definitivamente abrogato solo nel 1965. E qui abbiamo qualche domanda per la professoressa. La prima, come è nato il suo interesse per questa ricerca?
Hi, welcome. Thank you for that question. So my research actually began in a really interesting place with a curiosity that I discovered when I saw, through just a side suggestion from a former advisor when I was a graduate student, Peter D'Agostino, who had worked in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs archive in his own research. And he said, I saw this strange things in the archives about Italians going to farm cotton in Arkansas in the 1890s. And as that time, as I was training as a historian of the Southern United States, I said, that's really weird. Why would that be the case in a period where the region was really awash, full, right, of tractable labor? And so one of the things that I started to do was to follow this curiosity and say, what was happening in that period? Who were these Italian migrants who came as families? And what I saw when I finally got inside the diplomatic archives myself here in Rome was that the Italian government, and notably the ambassador to the United States at the time, Baron Saverio Fava, was a key supporter, at least initially, of this project, because he had as a goal, along with the De Bourdonnais administration at the time and the Italian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, he was watching the progress of immigration restriction in the United States. In the 1890s, Italians had started a period of massive emigration to the United States, in particular with the flows starting to shift and going to Brazil, the United States. That flow of migration would peak in 1907. So really we're talking about a massive shift really in the relationship between the US and Italy in this period. At the same time, as Daniele Fiorentino writes, that both nations were trying to kind of find their role in the world. So their relationship is really formed in the management of migration, as I argue. So what started off as this kind of like strange occurrence, what were Italians doing on cotton plantations in the middle of nowhere in Arkansas in the 1890s? And that over time, right, really grew into what I now see through the lens of the diplomatic archive, which is that the movement of Italians to the United States and back and forth between this country was really a massive project of managing migration that created what I call an asymmetrical partnership between the two nations. So the cooperation was essential, but Italy did not always have the power that it tried to exercise within this relationship. However, the United States also didn't have all of the power that it wanted to exercise either. They needed one another. The United States needed Italy to control its own borders here in the US. So that's sort of the pathway of how I got started. But I was just working in the ministry again the last 2 weeks, after having not been there since 2018 because of travel and COVID barriers. And things that I have found now new are just, it's such a rich and powerful archive that really shines a light that's really unprecedented on the construction of US border controls.
Grazie. Ecco, un'altra domanda, perché ce ne sarebbero molti. Leggendo, io ho avuto la possibilità di leggere il capitolo, l'introduzione del libro, veramente è ricchissima di spunti, quindi sono molto curiosa poi di vedere il resto del libro. Ecco, può spiegarci quali sono le principali novità storiografiche della sua ricerca? Perché appunto nella parte introduttiva lei cita tutti i riferimenti che sono stati essenziali per costruire, diciamo, il contesto interpretativo, però poi porta anche molti elementi nuovi. Ecco, ci può dire qualcosa, diciamo, riassumere quali sono le novità principali che questa prospettiva dischiude?
Sì, certo. So one of the things that I do in my work is to reconstruct the foundations of US gatekeeping. And in doing that, I am expanding the definition of gatekeeping and a key term, remote control, which the scholar Aristide Zolberg first defined. So he, and this is a quote from him, he said that remote control was, quote, the vast expansion of the American state's capacity to regulate movement across its borders. And he further emphasized, that was remote control because it brings in, it embraces and it demands in its work, the partnership of other sovereign states around the world in carrying out those US border control regulations. So most of the work on remote control, actually really almost all of it, focuses on the 1920s and afterward, when we see the outsourcing, of US border control in the regime of quantitative restriction. So historians, starting really from the foundational work of May Nye, have divided kind of the eras of restriction, beginning with Chinese exclusion in 1882, which set the foundations of this bureaucratic system of border control and regulation. And then that period, right, of what we call qualitative restriction, where we're looking at excluding people based on their qualities, how are they too poor, right? Do they have dangerous political beliefs? Do they carry diseases that are seen as dangerous to the body politic, either right ideas or physical diseases? As some of the key characteristics, are they seen as dangerous, right, to the labor force? Or there's some kind of other aspects in which restriction unfolds largely, right, with those qualitative categories until the 1920s, when quantitative restriction becomes the key aspect of this system of border control. So what I argue really is that the foundations of US gatekeeping, so before we can get to quantitative restriction, right, we have to move through the process of taking the rules that were initially established and the bureaucracy of control that was initially established to regulate Chinese migration into the country, and see how that expands into millions and millions more Europeans. And that transition happens through Italians. So we see it because Italians are the first group en masse to encounter these new laws and this new system. And really, it's quite a dramatic shift. So we see, right, that Italians tested and shaped this evolving gatekeeping system. But at the same time, we see that the system was really in flux in the 1890s, which is, again, the primary decade that I studied in my work. Really crosses that. This is also, in case listeners aren't totally aware of the timeline, this is also the first decade of Ellis Island, of its existence as an immigration station, having opened in January 1892. So one of the things that I see that I think is really important to the historiography is, again, like kind of bridging this gap, if you will, right? We know quite a lot about Chinese exclusion, particularly in the 19th century, and then moving into the 20th century. We know quite a lot about how border controls functioned against Mexican migrants. Again, in the 20th century, typically most of that work is centered. But what I do is I help to illuminate the foundations of this system beyond those very well-known and important groups in the United States. So that's something that's really important. But I think I also demonstrate that gatekeeping was not just about exclusion. Italians, their rate of rejection at Ellis Island was usually around 2% in the 1890s. So that's actually double the rate of other Europeans in this period. But then I have some cases that I examine, for instance, like the importance of the Port of New Orleans. So again, going all the way back to that beginning story of like how I got to this, and that was through the lens of Southern history. What I see is that, and what I write about is that the migration of Italians to the South, while in much, much smaller numbers than we see the distribution of Italians throughout the United States, is actually fundamental to understanding the cooperation and the asymmetric partnership, as I argue, between the US and Italy around the issue of migration control in this period. The South is like the place where particularly the Italian ambassador and then his successor, Baron Mayer de Planche, want to draw more Italian migrants. They want them to move away from the cities and go to the South, to these agricultural settlements. So that process as well is also an aspect of the historiography that's very underexplored, and that I am bringing forward as a way to also say, when we look at the foundations of gatekeeping and border controls, we must also look at the port of entry in the South, New Orleans in particular, to think about and to see, right, to really reveal the sort of messy origins of this gatekeeping regime in the way in which the US government began to outsource its border controls to other nations and to private companies like the Navigazione Generale Italiana, the main shipping line that was going back and forth between, in that period, primarily Palermo and New Orleans.
Bene, grazie. Ecco, lo diceva anche prima, le sue ricerche sono frutto di una lunga frequentazione degli archivi italiani, se non ricordo male, quasi 17 anni da quando ha iniziato, e in particolare quella del Ministero degli Affari Esteri a Roma. Ecco, in parte l'ha già detto, ma ci può spiegare l'importanza di questa fonte per la ricostruzione storica delle vicende delle quali si è occupata e di come questa documentazione integri quella disponibile negli Stati Uniti, perché se non ricordo male, appunto un problema è dato dalla lacuna che c'è per Ellis Island dovuta a una serie di istruzioni che ci sono state. Quindi ecco, come questi, anche in questa partnership, dal punto di vista delle fonti d'archivio, come si è realizzata nelle sue ricerche.
Sì, sì. The Archivio Storico Diplomatico of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs is absolutely essential to tell the story of U.S. border controls and the rise of restrictions on the freedom to move. So I really want to emphasize that while this is an Italy-U.S. story, it has repercussions for the freedom of movement of people around the world. And that, I think, as well, is a really important way in which looking at Italian diplomatic sources, it strengthens and it adds to, I think, the significance, right, of those sources, which are by and large neglected by U.S. Historians, by scholars writing in English. Now they're not, completely forgotten. They do appear more in the scholarship in the Italian historiography. But in terms of their significance for, as I've been arguing, right, for illuminating not just the construction of border controls, but really like the mechanisms of how this system was enacted. And that's a big gap, actually, in the US record, because there was a fire at Ellis Island in 1897, a massive fire that destroyed many, many buildings. And so we don't have much of the paper record here in the United States of the early mechanisms of gatekeeping enforcement. So for instance, what happened when you presented yourself, right, to a US immigration agent. Now, where that's missing, right, in the US record of the Immigration Department in its earliest years, having only been founded in 1891, which, by the way, it was founded 3 weeks after the New Orleans lynching of 11 Italians, the lowest point, right, the nadir of relations between the two countries. So those two events happened within 3 weeks of each other in 1891. But to come back to that, right, what we see is that the ambassador and his consuls kept close watch on what was happening to their migrants in the United States. And they saw their role, and they used the word protection, right, of immigrants, tutela. So in that way, they see their role not just to intervene, but also to observe and to track what was happening on the ground, as well as what was happening in the United States Congress in the process of immigration restriction and control. And their interventions come in multiple ways that are all richly documented in reports, letters, the private thoughts and correspondence about what the United States Congress is doing, what immigration officials are doing. The incident that I write about in the book Managing Migration in Italy and the United States concerns a ship called the Liguria. It was a ship of the Navigazione Generale Italiana that arrived in the port of New Orleans from Palermo with 1,483 people on board in October of 1904. The passengers were held aboard the ship for 6 days, which was an unprecedented amount of time, as the immigration service slowly processed the migrants on board, each day releasing a small number. But then, right, so the people who were detained on board, those who were questioned, and that was around 8% of the total number of passengers, again, an astounding percentage at the time. They were actually transferred to the city jail in New Orleans because there were no facilities to hold them in the port. the Italian government, the ambassador, the consul in New Orleans, Giacomo Ferraforni, they went ballistic, as we say, right? They could not believe not just how these passengers had been treated, but the ways in which the US government, in their eyes, was violating their own policies in regards to the LaGuardia passengers. So a flurry, right, of letters and telegrams and reports and newspaper clippings and interviews and stories fly back and forth between Rome, New Orleans, Washington about this particular incident. So after several months, the Italian government really isn't satisfied with the explanations of the US government, which you know, to follow the work of Tori Hesser and Lucy Salyer, the process of immigration, the jurisdiction, I should say, under which immigration cases fall is separate. It's on what Hester calls a parallel track to other criminal or civil matters. So protections don't apply. You don't have the same right to appeal through the court system, which is something that today, right, is still a particularly pernicious aspect of our immigration control system. And scholars using the frame crimmigration, intersection, right, of the carceral state, the prison state, and immigration control are doing a lot of really fascinating work there. But what we can see when we look at the Italian case and the LaGuardia one being one example that's I don't think has been discussed at all in the historiography. So we're bringing this anew, bringing this to light. What we see in the LaGuardia case is like the sort of roots of crimmigration in these more subtle and quotidian ways go way, way back, in this case to 1904. And there's another essay in our book as well that also looks much more deeply at the roots of policing and crimmigration, and that's by Matthew Bariglia. But one exciting thing that I found, again, this is, you know, the work of the historian and the archives, is very much a roller coaster of emotions. Some days are very boring and you look through the files and you think, well, maybe this might be important, and you kind of, your brain sort of starts to make connections. But the 2 weeks that I just had in this trip in the archives were like explosive. They were pianinicos. They were so fascinating. And some of the things that I just found literally yesterday were that there was a series of incidents in New Orleans following the LaGuardia incident, right, in 1905, a ship called the Lazio, still again from the NGI, where again, migrants are whose ability to enter the United States is in question. Okay, if they were at Ellis Island, there were facilities for which they would be, I'm going to say, a bit more humanely detained. Again, not to sort of frame that still as problematic. But in New Orleans, they were put in the city jail, and the Italian government was, again, quick to point out that was a clear violation of precedent at any other port of entry in that period. Now, of course, later at Angel Island after 1910 in the San Francisco harbor, that will become really the primary mode of controlling Asian migration. But we're looking here again at bridging this gap between, right, the initial rules of Chinese exclusion, and then how does the system get expanded to police, to control the movement of millions and millions more people in this period coming from Europe, coming from Italy primarily. So, you know, all of this to say, right, that Italian documents are absolutely foundational to this story, partly because of the unanticipated absence, right, of some American sources, because of the fire as I mentioned, at Ellis Island, and partly because of the role that Italian diplomats played in tracking, following, interfering, interceding, and shaping the US system as it evolved, becoming what I argue, right, truly are partners in gatekeeping, both and sometimes willingly and sometimes quite unwillingly, working to facilitate the construction of this system of border controls that continues to shape the freedom of movement of people today around the world.
Veramente ci ha dato delle proprio una visione di come la ricerca d'archivio fa scoprire nuove cose, sostanzia delle tesi interpretative e come questo, diciamo, illumini poi la storia del presente. Da un grande sfondo di, diciamo, anche di profondità storica questo controllo sull'immigrazione, questa interazione fra i governi che diventa, anche se in posizioni differenti, appunto asimmetriche, strategica per poter mettere in atto determinate politiche. Ecco, quindi la mia ultima domanda per la professoressa è questa. Ecco, lo studio delle politiche restrittive sull'immigrazione a livello transnazionale, perché la sua ricerca appunto fa vedere, illumina questo, il fatto come la politica dell'immigrazione diventa anche una forma della politica estera. Molto importante, e del controllo burocratico sul movimento delle persone attraverso le frontiere, non hanno soltanto un interesse storico, ma implicano anche molti interrogativi sul presente, naturalmente con le dovute differenze, dovute al diverso contesto storico e politico, però diciamo, è inevitabile che chi studia questi aspetti dal punto di vista storico si ponga anche nella prospettiva di chi assiste oggi a dinamiche che riguardano gli stessi temi, anche se appunto in contesti politici molto diversi. Ci può, da un osservatorio americano che diciamo, è in parte simile, in parte differente rispetto a quello europeo, ci può dire qualcosa su questo?
Sì, sì, sì. So one of the things that we at the Managing Migration in Italy and the United States at the book workshop we just had at Roma Tre just a few days ago, one of the things that was so profound in our conversation with the international authors who are going to be a part of that anthology, which will be published by De Gruyter, we saw that the origins, right, again, of this system of border controls, and particularly of the outsourcing of those controls to private companies, like shipping companies initially, right, which the Liguria incident reveals quite clearly. But today, you know, to airlines, right, or to other nations, for instance, right, to actually physically detain refugees and migrants as they move around the world. So this whole system has these powerful roots. You know, I argue, and we argue as a group in the Managing Migration anthology, in the transformation in really, you know, in the end of the era of the liberal state and from the 1890s into the 20th century. So for many historians, you know, this is something we talk about historicizing, which is when we draw a contemporary phenomenon and we say, let's look back not just at the roots, but like let's take a longer view, right, of the development of these contemporary phenomena, because we think as historians, we're not, you know, we don't operate as other fields do. We're not predictive. We don't create models like, you know, economists or political scientists in order to understand phenomena in the world. We historicize, right? We say, let's think about the, you know, the roots and the processes that culminated, right, in the world in which we see today, so that we can not just understand it, but we can confront it. I think from a position that allows us to understand that migration controls are artificial, they're constructed, they're created, right? And they can also be deconstructed. So in that way, you know, scholars of migration, we're more activist because we want our work to speak to the limitations on the freedom to move that exists in our world today. And we really want to confront, I think, the supposition that border controls are an essential facet of state sovereignty and security, because that's really, right, a kind of a foundation of the system and its understanding in our political system today. So we want to poke holes in that. We want to reveal, I think, the foundations of this of these restrictions, and also the rise of fears around the free movement of people, and why, particularly, I would say, democratic societies or republics such as the United States and Italy today see this need to police the borders using the kinds of methods of control that emerged, I argue, initially in the 1890s at the turn of the 20th century. I hope that answers your question somewhat. It's a great one.
Sì. Un altro aspetto molto, molto importante è quello dell'influenza che il contesto culturale e gli stereotipi in vigore, quello è un altro aspetto su cui lei giustamente fa riferimento, di come questo condizioni anche in modo differente nei due paesi, perché appunto fa un riferimento a questi stereotipi in Italia e negli Stati Uniti all'epoca, e come questo abbia poi influenzato il dibattito pubblico e le stesse poi politiche di controllo messe in atto per frenare e limitare questa immigrazione. Diciamo, mi sembra una prospettiva molto interessante. La pubblicazione del libro avverrà, speriamo, quest'anno.
La prossima, penso che sì, quando lo so.
Sì, no, noi saremo sicuramente molto interessati diciamo, ad acquisirlo per la biblioteca, perché sarà sicuramente un arricchimento. Intanto, diciamo, leggiamo le cose che già sono state pubblicate, probabilmente anche questa antologia di De Gruyter uscirà più o meno nello stesso periodo, immagino, e sarà anche questo, perché il programma del convegno, tra l'altro, era molto interessante. È un dibattito a più voci tra studiosi che si occupano di questi temi, quindi insomma ci auguriamo di rivederci e di essere aggiornati sulle prossime pubblicazioni. Grazie.
Grazie.
Grazie.